how we get them in, how we actually agree for refugees to come to the UK, but that makes it sound like once you get here it's a walk in the park, and I think we can all understand that that's really not the case. Matthew Powell isn't here, so I'm going to bring in our two speakers today are Sophie Williams from DocsNotCops and Matt Goldborough, who is an immigration lawyer working closely with London to Calais. So, Sophie, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, so hi. I'm really sorry, everyone. I'd hope that there might be a projector, but for the people in the front row, at least you get the benefit of the slides. Yeah, so I'm Sophie. I'm speaking from DocsNotCops, and that's an activist group that's made up of health workers and medical students and activists who are opposing the Immigration Act and prevent legislation in the NHS. And it was a group that was initiated by ACT UP, the HIV and gay rights activists based in London. So I'm going to talk a bit about the effect of the Immigration Act in the NHS, what it means for migrants accessing services and for those defending migrants' ability to access services, tell you some stories about what the Act has actually done, and what it means for NHS staff, and about how the rhetoric around immigration affects the NHS, including its ability to provide comprehensive care for all, including migrants, but for everyone in general. So this kind of campaign against the Immigration Act, it's a struggle where there can be no distinction between refugees and economic migrants, because that distinction becomes a wedge with which to dismantle the NHS as an institution for us all. So it kind of, although it sounds very specific from the outset, actually it has very far, wide-reaching implications. So in this session, so we're talking about struggles on arrival. So we're hearing about the brick walls as migrants arrive in the UK. And we can talk about brick walls in two senses, right? We can talk about the physical and the constructed, and migrants arriving in the UK face both. So there are obviously the physical walls that people encounter through the violence of borders, and there are the physical walls of detention centres. And then there are the walls that exist between people and the ability to live a decent life in this country. The walls that are erected kind of in queues to register at GP practices, or walls to access A&E services. And so these walls, the internal borders that we heard about this morning, are created by the existence of external borders of nations, of a perceived entitlement, this distinction between refugee, migrant, between good refugees, bad refugees. And then there's the arguments of austerity and of finite resources as well, that are peddled by the anti-immigration right, that conclude that migrants don't deserve housing or education or healthcare. And so I'm going to go into my first picture. And so this is us as a group of activists highlighting one of these borders. So we're outside the Royal London in Whitechapel, and basically we're giving information to both staff and users of the hospital about what the Immigration Act now means for them when they walk through those doors, and exactly how they'll be treated as patients as a consequence of their immigration status. So unlike the first two walls that I talked about, the walls of arriving in this country and the walls of being in detention, those being policed by police, the walls that I'm talking about only work by enlisting wider sections of society to police these boundaries, these borders, and those include landlords, social workers, teachers, and in what I'm interested in, the health service. And so this project requires individuals to really believe that the person in front of them is not the same as them, and that the person in front of them is different in some categorical way. And this is really helped by introducing statutory legislation to make people comply to it, and also bullying management as well, to make people work in line with what legislation is there. And together, this is what's happening in the NHS. It's both a group of people that work as what I'm going to describe later as overseas officers that are there to really push through the Immigration Act in the NHS. And then there's the management that encourages everybody else as members of staff within the NHS to pursue it. So, what has the Immigration Act actually said? So it's the 2014 Immigration Act, and basically it came through in different phases. So I'm afraid this is far too small for everyone to read, but the first phase was basically drawing up of some legislation. The second phase was to gather identification of people that would count as migrants using the NHS and who could be charged in the NHS. Phase 3 started in April of this year, where people were charged a surcharge on the...
Everything okay?
The third phase is where people were charged a surcharge on top of their visa costs, so anything between £150 and £200. Although I've heard some anecdotal stories of that being as high as £800. So there's no rationale to it whatsoever, but that started in April this year. And there's yet another phase where people will be charged not just for inpatient care, but for any care that requires a doctor. And so that means, although it says GP care is exempt, that actually means seeing a GP doctor rather than a GP nurse would be charged. Going to A&E would be charged, as well as being an inpatient. So, basically, I'm going to try and talk to you about what does the Immigration Act actually mean in the NHS through three different points. So one, before you enter an NHS hospital or a GP, when you're actually receiving care, and then lastly, once you've received care, what happens next. So basically, before people access care, the four things that you need to know about the Immigration Act, basically. So the Act was introduced in 2014, and its third phase, as highlighted here, started charging certain people up front of any hospital treatment. So there are two healthcare surcharges on visas for more than 6 months, and so it's either £150 if you're a student or £250 if you're a non-student, and that's for every year of your visa. Anyone who's not paid the surcharge and is not ordinarily resident in the UK can be asked to pay for inpatient services, regardless of whether they pay national insurance or tax. So you can pay national insurance, tax, contribute, whatever, and that you also have to pay the surcharge. And those who are non-EU nationals who don't have a visa, or those who are EU nationals who don't have a health insurance account or any health insurance, those individuals can be charged for all of their care at the rate of 150% of the NHS cost. So it's a profit-making mechanism as well. And even for those who've actually paid the surcharge, there's a get-out-of-jail card that says, if it's expensive, we could still charge you. So basically, some types of scans, some types of chemotherapy, for instance, there's no guarantee that you wouldn't actually be sent a bill at the end of your care, even though you've paid your surcharge. So the third thing that we need to know, the Act redefined ordinarily resident to mean that only people with indefinite leave to remain are automatically exempt. So everybody else who hasn't lived in the country for more than 5 years or more than 10 years, depending upon your circumstances, will be automatically put through this immigration process of checking whether they've paid the surcharge or not. And the fourth thing is that the Act encouraged GPs and other primary health services only to register individuals with a permanent address. And so they required a bill or a bank statement in order to be eligible. And so although GP services remain free at the moment in this current phase of the Act, it's actually become very difficult for people who are migrants in the UK to access those services. So that's when people are thinking about going to an NHS hospital. They've not even got there, they're just thinking about it. Right, so now they've got to a hospital. And so what things do we need to know about how the Act implements on access and treatment? So the Act puts new pressures on medical staff to decide whether treatment is immediately necessary or whether it can be withheld. And the Act states that hospitals can give immediately necessary treatment, but that the bill must be set at a cost of 150%. All non-urgent care must be withheld. And so the Act states that this decision can only be made by a doctor, but the common practice at the moment in many hospitals is for overseas officers, somebody paid solely to monitor the immigration status of patients, to monitor the treatments doctors give to patients without NHS numbers. And these are the patients that are most likely to be flagged up as migrants in the system. And so the overseas officers then question the medical team as to whether those treatments are urgent or not. Right, so that in itself sounds, we've got a group of people that are then policing how healthcare staff work in NHS hospitals. The second point, there's pressure on staff to identify who may not be eligible. And so although the Home Office claims that the new measures are not discriminatory, and Christ knows how they've come to that conclusion, because they apparently attack everybody's identity, they're in fact encouraging staff to profile individuals that walk through A&E. Thank you. While clinical administrative staff are not expected to ask for evidence, in fact the questionnaires that often you're given when you go to a GP or you go to A&E or that you've been sent to a hospital already state you to put down your immigration status. And so by the very fact that that's the job that you're being asked to do, you are already profiling people. Thirdly, there's now a legal obligation for NHS organisations to establish whether a patient should be charged or whether they should be exempt. And although the Secretary of State can waive any charges for a patient for exceptional humanitarian reasons, it just means that the Department of Health can cherry pick the cases that fit its own agenda. And if they really cared, why didn't they just extend the exemptions to everyone? So, fourthly, the key to the implementation of the Immigration Act is both clinical and administrative staff engaging with the overseas officers. And the Act requires NHS staff to raise the alarm to these particular individuals. Now, the Act makes it a statutory requirement for the hospitals to charge patients where they can. And because this is now adopted on often the contracts that lots of doctors and health workers have with their hospitals, it makes staff very vulnerable if they try to kind of boycott any of the Immigration Act or prevent legislation. And there are some groups of people and some illnesses that are stated in the Act as exempt from charging, including victims of torture, TB patients, other kind of infectious diseases. But that's often not adequately recognised by the individuals responsible for recouping the cost from the overseas officers, and them not actually being the clinicians involved. And to be classified as exempt from charges, evidence is provided to the hospital and to the overseas officers, the very same people whose job depends upon recouping those costs. So inevitably there is a positive reinforcement of trying to find people that you can charge and sending out those bills. So, what happens when people get a bill at the end of their care? So patients who are not deemed exempt by the hospital will receive a bill, and patients can be charged retrospectively. So even if they've been told in hospital that their care should be free, they can still have their case reviewed and still be sent a bill afterwards. Let's try and move through this a bit quicker. And so there are some statements that say things in the Act like, if it's not cost effective to recover the costs, or where there is no further practical means of pursuing debt recovery, the NHS hospitals should give people some slack. But given that the Secretary of State can also waiver these charges, that sounds like quite a few loopholes. But actually, in its implementation, I'll show you some of the figures later about what the discrepancies are between the charges and the bills that are sent out and how much money they recoup. So, in order to resist the implementation, everybody needs to make the overseas officers' jobs very difficult, and that will depend on many factors: the will of the staff, patients involved, and the consequences of the actions. And so at the end, I'm going to come through some examples of how we can all get involved in actually kind of resisting some of these things. So I want to just use some stories now to actually tell you what this means in the NHS. So, first story from Anna, so her name's been changed for this. Anna met an elderly woman being admitted through A&E at a London hospital. The woman came to A&E with her son, who was a UK national. She was so ill that she couldn't speak for herself. Her son said that she had returned from Nigeria and that she wasn't registered at a GP. Somebody who was part of the A&E team wasn't sure whether she was entitled to any care at an NHS hospital, and that person informed the overseas officer. The woman was really sick, and she did end up being admitted as an inpatient. And then, while she was being made comfortable and given some necessary treatments, the medical team waited for several days to give her the scans that she needed to get a diagnosis, because the overseas team deemed that they weren't urgent. So this means that her care was delayed, and in the end, there was actually a quirky twist to the story, and it turned out that she was a British national. So someone had just been overzealous to implement the Immigration Act. She went home without a bill, but that is not the case for so many people. So in this story, I think there are several things that we can talk about. So for the woman, she was initially questioned over her eligibility to access medical help at all. You know, if you're urgently ill, the Act even states that you should receive medical care. She was denied investigations that would have sped up her recovery. And staying in hospital longer is also a bit of a risk. You know, there are other ill people. You catch things if you stay in hospital for too long. And I think that's the basis of a discriminatory kind of case here. For the staff members involved, they didn't know about the requirement to treat anyone regardless of their immigration status if the care is deemed urgent. Both the the staff member involved and the overseas officers were too quick to enforce the Immigration Act without checking all of the information. And the overseas officer, not the medical team, were directing some aspects of the patient's care. So it's not that health workers have suddenly become racist, but that the pressure of management in the NHS has reached a breaking point and people crack. And I think this story perfectly illustrates the effects of the Act, discriminatory and widely inaccurately implemented. And there's also a very real question over the cost of the overseas officers themselves and how much money can be recouped at all. So this is way too small for people to read, but basically these are the results of freedom of information requests that DocsNotCops have made to all sorts of hospitals across the UK about how much of those hospitals billed for, how much money have they actually got, and how much money do they spend on the staff themselves in the act of recouping. And so there's some fascinating figures. So my own trust, North West Thames, so it spent £258,000 on the team, and it recouped £58,000, and that's in 1 year. So they recouped a quarter of the annual cost that it takes to implement these teams. They didn't actually tell us how much they initially billed for. But if we look at Barts, so they billed for £3.3 million worth of treatment, and they only recouped £300,000. So that's a tenth of the cost. So we've got some real it begs the question: is it worth harassing these people at all? And it's actually we're trying to work out what to do with these figures, because we don't want to send them to a place where they say you're not trying hard enough, you could get more back. Right. We're trying to make the argument that actually, is it worth it at all? So we're trying to think about something clever to do with that. And then secondly, I want to show you this picture. So this is a poster that was up in my ward, and basically it reads, NHS hospital treatment is not free for everyone. And it has a white guy with a stethoscope, a white patient, and 2 white women wearing blue uniforms. And then underneath it says, if you are visiting the UK or not here on a lawful or settled basis, you may have to pay for your care. So, so basically this comes from people, from a fear of immigration, and also a fear of health tourism. And I don't know if anyone here has come across the term health tourism, but I hear about it a lot. So the term was coined to describe the deliberate travel of people to the UK to use NHS services. It's been used to... Sorry, is it all right if I have a couple more minutes at the end? Thank you. So it's being used deliberately to divert the attention of health workers and the general public away from the systematic underfunding of the NHS, and to blame long waiting times or A&E queues on migrants visiting the UK only to use the NHS. And in fact, there is no good evidence to suggest that health tourism is much of a problem. So the government's own figures estimate it to be anywhere between £10 million and £70 million a year, stating it's impossible to estimate with confidence what the actual figure is. And looking at their numbers, basically, they look at where most people come from who visit the UK, they look at what their healthcare costs would be back in their home country, and they multiply the two. So where in that is there any evidence basis to suggest that this is the problem? And furthermore, when private financial initiatives, so these are the mortgages that hospitals are now paying back as a consequence of New Labour's policies, cost about £10 billion a year, so we're talking about a difference of like a factor of 10. The idea that health tourism is the cause of the crisis in the NHS is just laughable. But so back to the picture. The first message is that only white patients are eligible. The second message is that the NHS is a white British institution. Watch out if you're not white and British. And I don't know whether anyone in this room is a health worker, but many people will have visited a hospital. And this picture really fails to represent the diversity of people that work in the health sector. And this leads me on to my last few points. So I want to talk a bit about rhetoric around immigration and how it impacts on staff within the NHS. So in 2012, Theresa May announced that anyone earning under £35,000 after having been living in the country for 5 years would be deported at the end of the 6th year, and that would start from April next year. So this announcement was a token to the Tory right, who felt that Cameron wasn't representing their concerns about immigration seriously. But this will have devastating consequences for around 250,000 migrants in the UK next April, and that includes healthcare staff, from junior doctors to nurses to healthcare assistants. And so the Royal College of Nursing has said that this particular act will will cause chaos in the health service, with only senior nurses earning above 30,000. So nurses and healthcare assistants, which haven't been included on the list of shortage occupations, could find themselves being deported overnight. So the Royal College of Nurses estimated that up to 3,400 nurses, who cost the NHS 20 million to recruit, right, because they've not been training anyone back in the UK for such a long time, they're now looking to bring people here, that they'll be affected initially, but that by 2020, 30,000 nurses will be affected, and that they cost almost £180 million to recruit. And so that's 12% of the NHS nursing staff that could be forced out within 4 years. And that means continuing basically to recruit nurses from overseas but without securing them any career progression. So what happens is that they will recruit people into the UK and then deport them after 5 years. And that way they will continue to have a cheap labour pool that they can bully and they can undermine and that they can basically use to kind of undermine the effectiveness of the NHS. And so undoubtedly the effect of this policy will be uneven as well. Nationally it will be uneven. It will be hospitals in more diverse and urban areas that will be disproportionately affected. And again, that means lack of nursing staff, means unsafe conditions, and those will be affecting migrant and kind of working class communities. So I'm sorry that's very quick, but okay. So I just want to summarise by saying I hope I've been able to show you how the Immigration Act and the NHS simultaneously attacks migrants' health and ability to access health services. It attacks the staff who work in the NHS, and it attacks the ability of the NHS to continue to deliver a service. So to summarise, the things that we can do together, so we can put in freedom of information requests on whose identities are being checked in A&Es and what the overseas officers are doing, so like what we're doing with the money that they recoup. We can support patients through migrant solidarity groups. So there's a fantastic Soulfed group that's down in Brighton, and basically when they hear of a patient who's about to be charged, they go in and see the overseas officer, and they go and talk to the patient and their family, and they give them some support and some good legal advice. They then go and see the overseas officer, and they back up the individual's claims for to be exempt from the charges. For NHS staff, it's about non-communication with overseas officers, and it's about joining the alternative clinics that are being put on that allow people to avoid the immigration kind of checking that goes on when they arrive at A&E. So Doctors of the World run a migrants clinic in Bethnal Green, which basically aims at opening up access to people. So if you're interested, get involved in that. Demonstration outside hospitals and offices, so that's what DocsNotCops get involved in. Also migrant solidarity groups contacting Unison and Unite branches, because it's worth us making the links now so that come April, when we are defending people from being deported, that we've already got those networks of people that we can get involved in and meet up with quickly. And then keeping up to date. So there's a DocsNotCops website, and we try to keep up kind of that up to date with all of the latest immigration information. And if you have any personal stories as well, it's really helpful for us to be able to use those in how we go and talk to overseas officers and how we run educational services for different hospitals. So this is just a picture of us on the Unite, no, what was it? It was one of the demonstrations last year with our No Room for Racism in the NHS banner. But basically, thank you very much for your attention.
You get a very polished performance, I'm afraid. My name is Matthew Goldborough. I'm an immigration solicitor. I've been an immigration solicitor now for over 12 years. And sometimes when I come to think about immigration law and borders between countries, I'm the one who would actually vote for Christmas. I'm the turkey that would vote for Christmas, because actually I want the borders to open, and I want the immigration laws to be disbanded, and that's my starting position. I'm an internationalist, and that's where my starting position actually is. Theresa May doesn't think much of immigration solicitors. You may have heard a part of her speech, where at the Tory conference, when she said that she objected to immigration solicitors lawyers acting on behalf of their clients, i.e. migrants, refugees, whatever, and obstructing her ability to be able to remove them from the United Kingdom. That's what she said in the thing. Therefore, I'm sorry, Theresa May, I'm going to be a pain in your bum until the borders come down. Speaking personally, as myself, I'm the offspring of a refugee. My grandfather came from Russia in 1905. He was expelled from Russia because he was Jewish. He'd had the village burnt down, and he had people killed because they were Jewish. He left Russia because of that. Now that's a real refugee experience. Now, my other side of my family is another issue as well. They left France about 200 or so years ago because they were Protestant, and they were leaving Catholic France because they were persecuted because they were Protestant in France. Now, as it stands at the moment, I mean, as I say, I have been and gone to see, gone to Calais, gone to witness myself the situation in Calais. And 4,000, 5,000 people, doesn't matter who, there's still 4,000 or 5,000 people. And they're stuck at the border behind a raised wire fence, patrolled by immigration officers on behalf of Britain or police on behalf of France. And they're stuck in a situation. I mean, I'm looking at this bottle of water here. There's no clean water. You know, this is a situation on Britain's borders. If you actually, some of the refugee camps which are in the Middle East, at least they've got clean water. In Calais, they haven't got clean water. Now, part of all of this is Britain turns around and says to the world, many years ago, in 1951, when they signed up to the Refugee Convention, when they wrote the European Convention on Human Rights, when they signed up for membership of the European Union, and they signed up for qualification directive regarding treatment of asylum seekers. They did all this and other international conventions such as trafficking conventions and things like this. They do all this. It looks good on the television, doesn't it? You know, we care about human beings. We care about human rights of human beings. And then when it comes into practice, what they do is actually the complete opposite. They don't care that somebody is actually facing persecution in their own country. They don't care that people in their own country are facing human rights abuse at the hands of governments or at the hands of so-called non-state agents, etc., etc., etc. As I say, they have this obligation, and then they have this narrative. The narrative which says that, as has been said before, we have economic migrants, well, we're dealing with them through immigration controls, and we want to put a cap on those numbers for their own idiotic reasons, but nevertheless. And then they talk about, oh well, then there's refugees, but then there's genuine refugees, i.e. those who are stuck in camps somewhere in the Middle East, somewhere a long way away, from refugees have actually managed even to get as far as the United Kingdom, whereas of course a number of people haven't got as far as the United Kingdom. Because what they've done in the past is created a situation that if you try to flee your country because there is a problem and you think that the United Kingdom will be a good place to come to, what's the first thing you're supposed to do is to go along to the British Embassy and get a visa to come to the UK. Now, that of course is then an instant barrier because of course why do you want to come to the UK? I want to visit it. All right, you come to the UK to visit it. If you're lucky, you arrive at the airport and you turn up and say, actually, I want to claim asylum. Sorry. They turn around and say, well, sorry, you've arrived at the airport on a visitor visa and you've deceived us, haven't you? When you entered the country, you deceived us. Therefore, you are an illegal entrant. And it's the same from what my friend earlier on said. When she arrived in the country from Syria, she was a student here. And after being in the UK, a situation developed in Syria and she could no longer return to Syria and therefore makes an asylum claim. It is what is so-called a surplus asylum claim. But the first things first, the immigration officer in this country then turned around and said, oh, well, you feared going back when you arrived, and therefore you've deceived us now when you made your surplus asylum claim. So, again, And that, again, is a black mark straight against you for daring to make an asylum claim in the United Kingdom. You have the idea that if you make, because they are all full of this, that, oh, you should have made an asylum claim in the first available country. In other words, if you're in Syria, you go to Turkey, you make an asylum claim there. Problem, of course, is that sometimes a lot of countries in the Middle East aren't actually signatories of the Refugee Convention anyway. So they're actually not deemed safe countries. If people travel through Europe, Europe is supposedly deemed a safe country, safe set of countries rather. And yet, what is the reaction of numbers of borders, you know, like Hungary, like Croatia, etc., etc., etc.? Well, what are they doing? They are saying, again, they're refusing people to actually travel through Europe. And there's also questions, of course, is, in fact, let us say if you're a Hungarian Roma, for instance, is Hungary actually safe if you're Roma? The answer is no, it's not safe. But yet, Britain would say that you cannot make an asylum claim against Hungary because it's deemed safe, even if you're Roma and you've come to the UK. As I say, that's even assuming you get that far, because the determination process in the UK is so full of we don't believe you. There's a credibility. There is a huge. The first things that the British government says, we don't believe you. You've got to prove it that these things happen to you. Now, as pointed out by other people, how do you prove you're gay? It's one of those phenomenal questions that comes across day and day. It's actually the funny thing about, well, not so funny, the funny thing about if you try and make an asylum claim in the United Kingdom on the basis you're gay, it was one of those things that they've been systematically refusing people and saying, well, it's not within the Refugee Convention to be gay, and if you can only make an asylum claim if you're within the Refugee Convention. But I mean, they eventually accepted that maybe this could be possible. But as was suggested earlier on, people have been saying, well, what do I do to prove I'm gay? You know, I mean, and how much prejudice is involved in somebody determining whether somebody's gay or not? How much, you know, the invidious questioning that was involved of gay asylum seekers. I mean, I've dealt with many gay asylum seekers, and you know, they would put photographs together. This is me and this is me and my partner. This is us on a date, etc., 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 and all this. And they say, oh, you staged that. Even somebody said, well, maybe we should have a video of us having sex together, if that's what it takes. And I've even had immigration judges turn around and say, if you had done that, you're still staging it. It doesn't prove anything. And I mean, mind you, I've also had an immigration judge tell me that when he refused somebody's claim that they were actually married to each other, they said, you know, even if you had sex on the table in front of me, I wouldn't believe you're actually married. I mean, it's ludicrous. But these are the things that people have to face when they come to the United Kingdom. The idea that you've got to prove that you are a refugee, and you know that you have a so-called well-founded fear of persecution. One of the things that Cameron and May won't talk about is that for citizens from Syria, or citizens, or even people who are in Syria, are actually Iraqi citizens. You know, in other words, where Syria had become the country of habitual residence because they themselves had moved from Iraq to Syria. In fact, even Iraqis in Syria, having been driven across the border, they would be regarded as refugees. if they actually got as far as to the UK. If they actually got as far as to the UK, it is virtual policy, although they don't want to talk about it. It is also virtual policy that if you are Eritrean, and you come to and you actually manage to get as far as the United Kingdom, Britain will recognise that you cannot return to Eritrea because of the political situation and the military situation in Eritrea. And it is also virtually true of Sudan as well. But they would do everything they can to say, well, by the way, you're not Eritrean at all, you actually come from Ethiopia. By the way, you don't come from Sudan, you actually come from Kenya. They would do absolutely anything in order to say, you know, we don't believe you. Because, of course, a large number of people who come as refugees either will come because they have paid an agent to come here and therefore have got passports which are meaningless. But as I say, the situation then is that they will whatever happens. Let us say, that was a particular subject area of passports, because of course, yeah, okay, that's cool. If you try and come to the UK, as I said, you know, you need a visa. Sometimes people will pay agents to get a passport, to get a visa, especially, you know, if you, and then people manage to come to the UK, and they arrive and they don't know what they don't know, and then they get the passport taken off. Oh, you've entered on a passport that isn't yours, therefore we'll use that against you. Or, and this is what's happened in a number of cases for Zimbabwe, where Zimbabweans fleeing Robert Mugabe go to South Africa, manage to get a passport in South Africa, and then come to the UK and claimed asylum. Oh, you came with a South African passport, which is yours, therefore you are South African, not that you're Zimbabwean. And I mean, I've got a trafficking victim at the moment. At the present time, she's only 17, but she arrived with a trafficker with a passport that said she's 28. And the Home Office have got the passport, and they said, look, here you go, you got entry as somebody's spouse, you're 28, this is your name, we don't accept that you're the age that you are, therefore, we have no obligations to look after you, go back to Nigeria, and you are 28, and you're not a victim of trafficking. And anybody who would come across her, they would look at her. I mean, she's very small. She's only about so high. She's tiny, and yet, oh, by the way, you're 28, and you must have been mature because you can sell bottles of water on the local market, and that was worth highlight. But the determination process, as I say, is in all of these conventions is, you've got to prove your case. We won't facilitate, we won't help you to prove anything. And even if you have gone through that process, even if the Home Office refuse you, and then you end up going through an appeal process system, and eventually, if you're very lucky, and you may end up being recognised as a refugee if you're very lucky. And to that stage, of course, there's the next thing, which is only recently come out about now. Well, you've only got 28 days in which to, even if you haven't even got your papers yet. By the way, you're supposed to leave the accommodation that you've got. Otherwise, if you don't leave, you'll be expelled and you're put on the street. You've got nothing, and you haven't even got your papers yet to say that you can go and sign on. I mean, it's in other words, even if you are accepted as being a refugee in this country, which is not that rare, which is fairly rare, then you'll still end up on the street. This is the so-called welcome for genuine refugees, by the way. so-called genuine refugees and their version of history. And this Cameron's promise about all 20,000 people in 4 years, I don't really want to talk about figures. We're talking about people here, and the reality for Cameron is he knows very well that he wants to cherry pick from people in Syria, from the Syrian camps. That's all he wants to. He doesn't want to cherry pick from anywhere else, you know. But there's never been any cherry picking from, let us say, Palestinian refugee camps. But at the moment he's saying we want to cherry pick. Well, the reality is, back to what my friend said earlier on. I want to go back to Syria. She wants to go back to Syria. She doesn't want to necessarily be cherry picked from somewhere in Turkey to come to the UK. And so people in that situation would actually rather stay in the camp somewhere in Turkey rather than being dragged to Britain. So Cameron knows that very well. So in fact, the likelihood, by that means, the so-called 20,000 genuine in 5 years, the reality is that they won't. Those 20,000 come. You know, and he will turn around. I mean, because it was once said there is, in theory, is an ongoing policy which has had that, and which was to do with about 5,000, of which only about 1,100 have actually come. 3,900 under that previous scheme haven't actually come. So in other words, what he's doing is not talking about people as people. He's talking about numbers. He's talking about numbers. He's talking about numbers of migration, nothing else. That's why he's saying all 20. I'm sorry, I'm not with the speaker earlier on about the idea that Britain should take its fair share. I'm sorry, Britain should open the bloody border. I mean, there is no sense of fairness in any of this. As I say, we are dealing with this from a very, very harsh position, because the way that the 2014 Act was mentioned earlier on is that we've restricted people's rights of appeal. And so much so that it's been found that if you have an asylum claim or a human rights claim, and this Home Office decide that they're going to certify that claim, which means that you can only appeal the decision from abroad. You can't appeal it in the United Kingdom. In other words, you will have to be removed before you can appeal the decision. Now, how does that work on a refugee claim? I've no idea, because it will mean that you'll have to go back to, let us say, go back to Syria, and then you can have your appeal heard in the UK when you're not here. How does that work? It doesn't work at all. It is not offering people international protection, which Britain says it has signed up to when it signed up to the Refugee Convention. The next issue again on that, I mean, as I'll talk very briefly about other situations whereby, as I said, I want to open the borders up. The reality is Britain is putting into place closed borders even in country. My friend has pointed out about the NHS. There's another one that people would probably more come across as well, which is employment. How many people who are foreign nationals who are working in whatever job it is, and their status will come to an end in about, say, 6 months' time, and they will be making their application again to start. Employers turn around to them and say, well, it's going to come to the end, then your contract will end at that point. And this is absolutely discriminatory decision-making in saying that somebody can no longer work because their immigration status has come to an end, even knowing damn well that they will be making an application for it to be extended. This has happened. I've a number of issues on this. I've got a number of employment tribunal cases because of this, where foreign nationals who've got leave to remain in the country, they've got a job and paying their taxes, quite right. They will now have to make their further leave application, pay the NHS surcharge, even though they've been paying NI for the last 3-4 years, doesn't matter. And the employer has said, sorry, I can't employ you anymore. You know, when you come back again with your passport sorted out, in the meantime, no, you're out of work. And, of course, because you're a foreign national, you can't claim benefits either. So in other words, you impoverish foreign nationals in the country during the whole process of swapping over or when they apply for further leave. Now, just one further point on that, because we're going to talk about refugees in country. In the past, if you're recognised as a refugee, you were given what is known as indefinite leave to remain. In other words, you were treated as if you were a British citizen. Is the way that they essentially put it. That was changed to several years ago now, such that you made an asylum claim, you became a refugee, a fine tick box. You're given 5 years, and at the end of the 5th year, you could apply for indefinite leave to remain, and your case would be subject to, unquote, active review. Now, what that meant for some people, of course, is that the choice about where they were going to be is now back in question again. In other words, if the country situation has reversed, let us say you left because you were part of the Civil War, you're part of the Civil War won. Now some people just simply turn around and say, well, I'm going back home anyway. But others, no, they said, well, I've made my life in Britain now, so surely I should be allowed to stay here. And they say, no, actually, just because you chose, it's now safe for you to return. So in other words, on active review, you will get sent back. And this is the very thing that Theresa May was talking about. She wants to make even people who are recognised as refugees into an extremely precarious situation, that they would be, their cases would be actively reviewed 1 year, every 2 years, in the way it is actually done in Germany. In other words, that you will never be permanently anywhere. There will always be subject to active review. And considering the state of play of, let us say, I'll take one country in particular, say Somalia, the British government have recognised for a long period of time that, by the way, actually for Somalia it was a bit of a problem, but you could still go back. You know, you'd be safe in various bits and pieces. Eventually, the European Court said that's rubbish. You can't do it. You can't do it. I mean, you know. And eventually, all right, maybe. And now a few years ago, they sent William Hague down there and, with several armoured cars and various military around him, and he turned around and said, "Oh, it's getting a bit safe here now. It's getting a bit safe here. You know, I was safe. I'm fine. You know." And Home Office have been saying, "Well, it is safe. That little bit there, that bit around Mogadishu Airport and up through the refugee camps, it's safe in that bit. Forget about Al Shabaab. You know, it's safe there. Therefore, anybody who's Somali can go back there." Now, it's rubbish, because they discovered, of course, that the refugee camps themselves were, you ended up with where Somali women were being raped by UN troops. I mean, it's in other words, it is not a safe environment for people to go back to Somalia, but they were doing all they can to say that it is safe, and therefore there's no need for Somalis to remain in the UK. Anyway, as I say, in conclusion, it is not so much a welcome to refugees in the UK. It is very much a reactive, and it is very much a case of, thank you very much, you're a refugee here, but however we want you to leave ASAP. So as I said at the very beginning, I'm sorry, no. My position is open borders and let me retire.